We do have a lot of material to cover today, so let's get started. And we are now starting part 2 on rationality theory. In Galt's speech, Rand wrote that moral perfection is unbreached rationality. Well, obviously not violating rationality requires knowing it, recognizing rationality and irrationality as fully as possible. Being dedicated to practicing rationality requires understanding its value. So today we have 2 main tasks. We're going to discuss what reason is, and second, why it's valuable, why it's appropriate, why we should be rational. So, what reason is? Yesterday we surveyed prevalent images of reason, both popular and philosophical. Today we're going to address what reason actually is. And we're going to start by looking at some alternatives, as you can see on the outline. Rationality concerns your way of using your mind. What is rationality differentiated from? What other ways of using one's mind could one adopt? Well, one rich source of clues comes from what is irrational. So, what are the most prominent alternatives to reason? A person could accept conclusions or act on the basis of reason, or on the basis of what? What else? Let's list a few of the alternatives. This isn't an exhaustive list, but let's list some other ways, non-rational ways of proceeding. One way would be to simply follow authority. And what I mean by that is doing things on the say-so of someone else, doing things or accepting certain beliefs on the say-so of someone else who holds power, who's in a position of authority. Blind obedience or submission to such an authority. He's the boss, he's the big shot, he's the mayor, he's the guy in charge. This is what the church says, this is what the Pope has decreed, okay? That's the basic idea here. Now, to be clear, I do want to distinguish this from informed deference to someone who you know to be a qualified expert in some area. Okay? When you go to a physician because he knows a lot more about the kind of health problem that you've been having, that's reasonable. Okay? When you go to a tax accountant, when you go to somebody who's a lot more knowledgeable about computers, for instance, that's okay. But what I'm talking about here is ignorant surrender to someone for no reason, for no other reason than that he claims to be or enjoys the status of an authority, a powerful person. Okay? The idea of just following orders. Don't ask questions, just, go along, he's the guy in charge. Another alternative to rationality is obviously proceeding on the basis of faith. Whether this is religious faith or secular, whether there's an elaborate roster of particular tenets and rules about prayer and holy days and diet and particular obligations, or whether it's simple and unadorned by such specifics, the essence of going by faith is accepting ideas without evidence, just believing. Accepting without evidence. There's a line from Benjamin Franklin that I think nicely captures the complete antithesis between reason and faith. Franklin once wrote, quote, "The way to see faith is to shut the eye of reason." And that says it, okay? The way to see faith is to shut the eye of reason. Ben Franklin, he got that right. Yet another alternative to proceeding rationally is proceeding by emotion. Indulging your moods, whatever you feel like doing. And in a related vein, indulging your desires unchecked by reason. Simply setting aside other considerations. So for instance, I didn't feel like going to work this morning, so I called in sick. Now, I'm not talking about you didn't feel well, okay, you were physically sick. It's just, I didn't feel like going to work this morning, okay, so I called in sick. I didn't want to call the doctor, so I put it off again. I'll do it tomorrow, okay? That's the sort of thing, just giving in to your feelings, your desires, unchecked by whether reason approves of acting that way in this situation. Yet another alternative to rationality, proceeding according to consensus, what the group believes, what society wants, popular opinion. Now notice, this is not always eager. That is, you don't have to think only of the person who's sort of panting and can't wait to do what everybody else in the crowd is doing. Very often people are reluctant, somewhat grudging, but do in the end go along with things simply because this is what everyone else is doing. Everybody thinks this, I guess they're right. I guess so, they all seem to think so, they all seem to be doing that. And again, this is, I think, the form that's a little bit more tempting sometimes to some of us who, when you put it up in a classroom, it sounds, what objectivist would ever do such a thing? Well, another alternative, bigotry, prejudice. You take some unfounded idea and run with it, interpreting everything in light of this and judging people on that basis. The racist, of course, is a stark example here. Yet another alternative, astrology, in its various forms. Horoscope, psychic, palm readers, tea leaf readers, tarot card readers, numerology. There's a lot of this these days. Tradition, yet another alternative to reason. That's the way things have always been done. It was good enough for my grandparents, it's good enough for me, for us, for our family. Another alternative that's actually behind many of these, I don't know if we should call it another alternative exactly, but behind many of these we can say is simple lack of effort, a kind of laziness, not bothering to think, to trace relationships between facts or ideas, drifting into one or another of these alternatives to reason as the mood seems to make suitable to you, right? In other words, one can be irrational, not simply by consistently going by faith or consistently going by the consensus of the group or emotion, etc. One can drift in and out of these various alternatives, okay? That's another common form of irrationality. And again, this is not an exhaustive inventory. One can think, one could add to the list, one can think further about the relationship between some of these. Emotion probably underlies all of the others in the end, but that's not our immediate point now, okay? Now, considering these, I think, opens the way to appreciate the answer to our question, what is rationality? What's the common denominator among these various forms of non-reason, among these alternatives? Well, actually, rather than an ingredient present in all of them, a common denominator, there's something that's missing from all of them. First-hand observation of reality. A person's own recognition of the relevant facts and his own judgment about the significance of those facts, what they mean, what they indicate. For example, my psychic, the person who goes by astrology in some form, my psychic said we'd be a good couple. Or my horoscope said, Gemini, Pisces, very copacetic, terrific. I follow that, ignoring the facts that I have noticed about this person. He's irresponsible. He's irritable. I actually find him irritating, right? But, indeed, if this is what the horoscope says, forget the facts. Set those aside, what you have observed. Another example, tradition. Well, this is the way the company's operated since Grandpa founded it in 1899. Ignoring facts governing the contemporary marketplace, contemporary manufacturing techniques. Or emotion. I'm frustrated. It's been a lousy day. I just got 2 rejection letters from publishers, let's say, not an uncommon occurrence, and a parking ticket. So I'm in a foul mood, right? I'm mad at the world. A friend makes some minor innocent mistake. I lash out at him. What am I doing? Indulging this emotion, distorting the nature of what he has done, ignoring the fact that he doesn't deserve my wrath, right? I just feel like venting, so damn it, I take advantage of the first warm-blooded target who walks along. Okay? Again, in all of these cases, you're ignoring the relevant facts. Even the bigot, the racist, must tune out contrary evidence to maintain his prejudices against a certain group. Imagine the racist who is prejudiced against blacks, right? He's got to ignore any evidence that comes his way of blacks who are intelligent, industrious, responsible. Whether in his personal experience or even if he's insulated himself considerably from encountering blacks, from what he sees on television, from what he reads in newspapers and magazines, right? He's also got to tune out evidence of whites who are stupid, lazy, and irresponsible. He's got to tune out, ignore evidence of what makes a person industrious, responsible, or not. The role of individual choice. The point is, in each case, the person being irrational either doesn't bother to collect the relevant evidence or he doesn't give it its due. He sets it aside, he ignores it, he minimizes it or exaggerates its significance. So the lesson, and this is the next item on the outline, the lesson is really very simple. Irrationality omits or distorts reality. Rationality takes proper account of reality. Rationality at bottom is a matter of following the facts. Consider a paradigm of rationality, the scientific method. How does the scientist proceed? He tests a hypothesis by observation, experiment, repeated trials. He makes stringent efforts to eliminate all extraneous factors that may influence the outcome and lead to incorrect conclusions based on his observations. He considers all possible explanations for what he is observing. What drives this? Why proceed in this manner, in this scientific way? What drives this? Fidelity to reality, a quest for accuracy. The only way to determine whether this chemical really is causally responsible for this effect under these conditions is by looking at it, by inspecting it, i.e., by first-hand observation of the relevant reality. Consider some of the paragons of rationality in Ayn Rand's fiction. What makes them so? What distinguishes them as rational? Well, think about Rourke in The Fountainhead, declining the commission for the Manhattan Bank building. Rourke desperately needs the money to keep his architecture practice open. He desperately wants to work as an architect. He wants to build that building. But once the board imposes certain requirements on the design, he recognizes that building it would compromise his values. He might wish that weren't the case, but he sees that it is, and he accepts that knowledge. He doesn't push it away. He doesn't squabble with himself, oh, but I need this so much, oh, but I really want to do this damn building. He focuses on reality, what building it under the terms that they would like to impose would mean. And despite the colossal disappointment that this represents, despite the consequences for his future in the profession, he declines. The integrity that Rourke displays there is an application of rationality. It is fidelity to reality. It's an eloquent display of rationality precisely because we know how high the stakes and how strong the temptation to give in would be for most people. Or consider another example, another model of rationality, this time from Atlas, Francisco. Francisco wants to tell Dagny he's not a degenerate playboy. To say the least, she means a great deal to him. I mean, I think we ache for Francisco for how much he loves her, right? But he doesn't tell her. Why not? He recognizes that she is not yet ready to really understand, and he doesn't want to risk the long-term project that he's embarked upon, which is more important than her approval of him at any moment. His emotions at times may be intensely at odds with this course, not telling her, but like Rourke, he accepts reality. He doesn't try to get around it, he doesn't try to fudge it, he doesn't try to have things both ways. He accepts the consequences of his course, including the consequences that are most painful to him. What makes all of Rand's heroic figures exemplars of rationality is their intransigent devotion to reality, to the facts, to their knowledge of reality. So again, rationality is essentially a matter of following the facts, tracking the truth. Notice certain colloquial expressions that testify to this account of reason. Use your head, we say sometimes, meaning pay attention to the facts, right? Put these facts together, add them up. Think about the implications here. Think about the consequences. In reality, think about what's really going to happen if you do this, right? Get a grip, we say. Now, sometimes we mean get a grip on yourself. Sometimes we mean get a grip on reality. Still working? Sounds different. Okay. Get a grip on reality, or else be realistic. Get real. You're doing yourself no good by indulging in fantasies, by misrepresenting your skills, how good or bad you are at something, by misrepresenting your feelings for this person or whether they're reciprocated, etc., right? The very definition of serious mental illness is having lost contact with reality. So let's consider the issue now from a different angle. Moving on to the next point, the means of knowledge is what I've called it on the outline. What are human beings' means of knowledge? How can we acquire information about reality? Basically, through two sorts of means. Our five senses, these are our inlets, these are our avenues for acquiring information about the world. These are the arteries of knowledge, you might say. And at a further level, we can identify what we observe, trace relationships between what we observe. Notice if this thing is so, then this other thing must be so. I observe it's raining. Since it's raining, I don't need to water my garden today. Or my tennis match will be canceled. Or I should bring an umbrella if I'm going out. We sometimes use reason. We sometimes try to identify and trace relationships to... we sometimes identify and trace relationships to try to explain events, not only to tell us what we should do, but to understand things that have happened. A bunch of people get sick at a wedding. We try to figure out what was the cause. We inquire about the water, about what they ate, was it all the people who stayed in the same hotel, who came on the same plane, etc., to isolate what might have caused this. The point is, reason allows us to extend our knowledge beyond what's immediately apparent to us, what's observed through our senses right now. Thus, Rand's definition of reason: the faculty that identifies and integrates the material provided by man's senses. Do you want that again? Some of you? The faculty that identifies and integrates the material provided by man's senses. That is Rand's definition of reason. To be rational, then, is to exercise that faculty to do those things, to accurately identify facts and to integrate consistently. Reasoning, or being rational, consists of naming things and doing things with the facts that we've named. In particular, drawing inferences, making connections, integrating. Thus, the basic nature of reason is very simple, straightforward. There's nothing very technical about reason. We use reason to do all sorts of mundane things every day. We use it to do much more sophisticated things as well, but it also encompasses the relatively mundane decisions that we make. Which credit card to use? Well, this one has this interest rate, but I get those frequent flyer miles, but this other one gives me a certain discount if I use it at a certain store, etc., right? And you know the score, you know the things you figure out here, right? Should I finish this book I've just started? I'm not enjoying it as much as I expected. It's not quite what I thought it was going to be. Well, how do you decide? You have to consider, is this a book you're simply reading for pleasure? You just thought this was going to be fun, it's vacation, you're entitled to do some of that reading. Is this a book you're going to be examined on Monday morning in some important test? Is this a book you've agreed to review in the next week, etc.? Now notice an important implication of what I've said so far. And this is the next point on the outline. Reason is not simply steps between propositions or links between ideas. It's not only a chain of inferences. In other words, the instrumentalist conception of reason that I referred to yesterday when I quoted Bertrand Russell, that is incomplete. Reasoning is that, means-end reasoning, but it is also, importantly, proper identifications of your starting points. In other words, reasoning involves both proper identification of facts to begin with and proper inferences from what you observe to things that you haven't already observed, from what you know to what you don't already know. Okay? So reason is both. It is inferences, it is means-end reasoning and, making connections and linking up different pieces of information, but it's not only that. The identification part is also important. I'll actually return to this theme tomorrow, I think. Without proper identifications of the starting points, reason is suspended from facts and becomes a game. The essence of rationality is proceeding by the facts, facts that are relatively easy to know, as well as those that are more difficult to grasp. The less obvious, the facts that require sometimes very lengthy and elaborate chains of inferences. Again, I think I alluded to this yesterday, many people, objectivists and non-objectivists, tend to equate rationality with only its most sophisticated forms. You know, relatively difficult mathematical formulas, things in calculus, physics, engineering, right? They think, that's real reason, the rest is common sense. But in fact, reason doesn't refer only to the hard stuff. It is more inclusive, and I think realizing this can be useful because it allows us to recognize more occasions on which we can be rational or irrational. Okay? All right, then a final question before we leave this issue of what reason is. If rationality is a matter of following the facts, as I've put it, what facts should I follow? There are a lot of facts out there. Which should I pay attention to in order to be rational? Well, that depends on your aim, your purpose. You cannot assess the rationality of an action until you know what it's intended to accomplish. For example, your decision to attend this conference, was it rational? The answer depends on what you were after. You were aware of all sorts of facts relevant to the conference. You're aware of all sorts of facts irrelevant to the conference, right? You had to sort those out in making your decision. You're aware of the cost of the conference, the duration, the dates, perhaps that Nashua was voted, was rated by Money Magazine as best city to live in or something like that about a year ago. The fact that there aren't tennis courts right here at the hotel and that Peikoff wasn't going to be here this year, and the fact that New Hampshire, it has a certain climate in this time of year. You might know the state bird of New Hampshire, the fact that you like the license plates of New Hampshire, other things going on in your life at this time of year, right? There's all this. Which of these should weigh in your decision to make it rational? Well, the answer depends on your primary aim, right? Do you seek above all, in this context, to deepen your understanding of certain aspects of objectivism, to meet other objectivists, to marry an objectivist, to have a nice vacation, to blend, as many people reasonably want to do, some intellectual stimulation with vacation, relaxing, physical recreation, right? Maybe you're an avid bird watcher, and this is the only time of year on the North American continent that a certain rare species appears in this part of New Hampshire, etc. Identifying a purpose is essential to understanding what rationality demands. You must identify the significance and weight of that purpose alongside other purposes in your life. Maybe you're saving money for a business that you've been planning on starting for the last 10 years and it's getting close, but you really can't afford this expenditure given that very important goal to you. Maybe you're getting married this week and it's not a good idea to not be there this week or for the wedding itself, I guess. Right? Of course, that's where one of those might come in handy, I guess. I don't know. Talk to your astrologist and get around that. Obviously, once you establish what your goals are, you have to identify the facts that bear on the realization of those goals. So purposes, as well as the means of advancing one's purposes, are both crucial to assessing the rationality of a given course of action. Now, another obvious implication of what I've just been saying is that rationality is contextual. The exact rational course will vary for different individuals in different situations. The same facts may be reasons for different individuals to perform different actions depending on their ends and their circumstances. It can be rational for one objectivist to attend this conference and for another not to, or for you to attend this year and not next year, depending on many variables. Or to change the example, it can be rational to accept a job when the primary goal is maximizing income, irrational when the primary goal is maximizing free time. What is rational, again, depends on your ends, relevant facts of your circumstances, your abilities, your other resources, your knowledge, etc. So to reiterate the main point so far, in essence, reason is grasp of reality. Rationality is a matter of following the facts, dedicated pursuit to the relevant facts. To be rational is to exercise your faculty to identify and integrate the material provided by your senses. And I think in this spirit we can understand some of what Leonard Peikoff was getting at when he remarked in his piece several years back, his piece on 30 years with Ayn Rand, that Rand treated ideas as man's means of grasping the world. That, I think, was the calling card of her rationality. It was all about reality. Okay? All right, that's it for part one of today. So let's move to the next big subject. Why be rational? Now, the explanation of what reason is feeds directly into the explanation of why we should be rational. Indeed, the more thoroughly we understand what reason is, the less of a question why we should be rational becomes, I think. I think the answer becomes fairly apparent. Before answering the question directly, though, let's address an initial misgiving that people sometimes have about the question, why be rational? The misgiving is this: does the question assume that we should be rational? That is, we could have reason to be rational only if we already thought that we should do what we have reason to do. But that's what we're inquiring about when we ask, well, why be rational? Should I be rational? Well, let me put it another way. To require a reason to be rational is to rely on the requirements that are imposed by rationality, namely the need for reasons. You got to have reasons for what you're going to do, right? That's what rationality tells us. But you might think then, why be rational is an illegitimate question. Because taking it seriously, thinking, yes, that's an important question, and we should think about what the answer to that question is, taking the question seriously, you might think, assumes already the importance of being rational, yet that's what we're supposed to be showing in answering the question. Did you follow that? Yeah? You want to once again, or most of you are saying yes? I'll say the last little bit once again, okay? To require a reason to be rational is to rely on the requirements that are imposed by rationality, that are imposed if you had already accepted, yes, rationality is our standard. We've got to be rational. That would be why you'd want a reason to be rational, okay? But if we're asking why be rational, it seems that we shouldn't already suppose that the standard of rationality is appropriate. This is a question that people sometimes have, okay? Now, in fact, the question, though, why be rational, cannot be dodged so easily or, shunted aside as an inappropriate or unanswerable question. We can't simply take for granted the propriety of rationality. Given the alternatives, several of the alternatives which we've already looked at to proceeding rationally, it's natural and logical to ask why we should follow reason instead of one or another of these other ways of thinking and proceeding. To simply accept the authority of reason would, to simply accept it and say, no, we can't give an explanation of it, we shouldn't even entertain this question, why be rational? To simply accept the authority of reason would convert reason into a matter of faith. It would be to accept reason for no reason. So to figure out whether we should be rational, we must ask why. The fact that the only answers will come in the form of reasons simply indicates the power of reason, how fundamental it is. It indicates that it is inescapable. Reason is inescapable in any logical thinking about how we should conduct our thinking and our actions. So then, let's move on to more directly address the question, why be rational? We saw already, irrational decisions omit or distort reality. But things do not change because of your beliefs or attitudes toward them. Adherence to traditional production methods will not make the family business competitive if newer methods are much more cost efficient. Or consider balancing your budget. Suppose you've recognized all the demands on your income in the next year or so. You set strict limits on what the expenditures can be for you for the next year or so. And you do need a new car, but it's got to be, you've decided, a very modest, relatively inexpensive car. Yet you then, a week or two after you actually sat down and did all this budgeting and this firm resolution about spending money, you give in to the desire for this other car that's a little bit spiffier that you really can't afford. And that would break the budget that you had just planned on, right? You say things like, well, I should be able to have that car. I'm a respectable person. I'm an adult. I make a good salary. A professor ought to be able to have a car like that, or a lawyer, perhaps a little bit more credibly, a lawyer ought to be able to have a car like that, right? Not rational. Not rational. Why? Because your wishful thinking does not catapult you into a different economic bracket, right? You've still only got the income and the wealth that you had that night when you were figuring this all out. The simple lesson is rationality is required to navigate the world successfully. to grasp the nature of things, especially aspects of things that affect us, to inform our decisions, to determine how to act to advance our aims, whether the aims are, again, modest or long range, everyday or much more ambitious. Irrationality is counterproductive. It's self-defeating. Let's look at this from a different angle. I'm going to be doing a fair amount of that, I guess. Look at it from one way, and then let's try to illuminate it by looking at it from some different perspectives. Think about the most basic conditions that give rise to the propriety of rationality. What facts about us, about the world, does the propriety of rationality depend on? Essentially 3. Free will, fallibility, and the primacy of existence. Again, these are conditions that give rise to the propriety of rationality, if you need a heading for this. And here, I must say, this is something that Harry Binswanger stressed in some of his OGC sessions in the fall that I was listening in on, okay? But, quickly, free will. We control our mental processes. It's up to us how we use our minds, whether to use our minds. Rourke could have accepted that building commission, the Manhattan Bank building, right? Francisco could have blurted out the truth to Dagny at any point. Scientists could fudge the data. You or I could give in to emotions or prejudice or consensus, etc., in any decision-making situation. We control our mental processes. Second, we are fallible. We're not automatically correct in our thinking. Human beings are capable of making mistakes. Our thoughts are not necessarily accurate, but they need to be accurate for us to succeed. We don't automatically think rationally, and even when we do employ reason, when we do try to track reality, we can go astray, we can make mistakes. That's why we need to employ a particular procedure best suited to deliver the object of our thinking, the facts. Okay. And then the third condition giving rise to the need for rationality, the most fundamental here, is the primacy of existence. The fact that existence is independent of consciousness. The fact that the nature of things is not a product of our thoughts or wishes. The fact that wishes don't make things so. Notice, if they did, if wishes had that power, there would be no need for reason. Why identify things or integrate things as rationality instructs, right? Identify what you're observing, integrate the observations you're making. Why bother to identify or integrate things if instead you could change them at will, right? Why seek to identify the cause of cancer as part of the search for a cure for cancer if instead you could simply will it away? You could wish cancer into impotence. Why seek to identify a path to running a successful business if the relevant facts about the product, the manufacturing, marketing, management, etc. could be altered at wish? Now clearly we know this is ridiculous because we know they can't be. The facts can't be altered at will. That's why we must be rational. So the case for reason ultimately stems from the nature of reality. It is, as Rand said, a reflection of Bacon's dictum that nature to be commanded must be obeyed. At bottom, the only reason to obey reason is to guide one's judgment and actions by the way things really are. That makes sense because reality, everything that exists, has a definite nature that is independent of individuals' thoughts and wishes. Reality is mind independent. Its nature does not depend on us. This entails that if we wish to achieve any ends, we must identify the nature of the relevant aspects of reality and act accordingly. If I want to live, I must eat. So I must find food or make my own food or find a job or make a product or offer a service that I can trade with other people in order to get money to get food, right? If I want to produce an Objectivist conference, I have to line up suitable speakers, secure accommodations, determine prices, advertise, etc. Even if I want to kill myself, I must learn which techniques are effective. Only certain drugs or weapons will do the trick, right? Reason is necessary for the achievement of any purposes. good or bad, positive or negative, life-furthering or destructive. Because you must heed reality to achieve a purpose. If the consequences of your actions truly did not matter to you, if they were completely immaterial, then you would have nothing to be gained by being rational. There would be nothing to be gained by being rational, okay? There would be no point to being rational. So in a broad sense, we can say that the justification of rationality is two-pronged. It rests on the nature of reality, free will, fallibility, the primacy of existence, and a person's having purposes. Primarily the purpose of living. I'll be saying a little bit more on that. Irrationality would make sense, would be rational, only if a person were utterly indifferent to his life, to his experience, to what happens to him. If he had no ends whatsoever, he didn't give a damn what happened, how it happened, whether he lived or died, okay? But if you care about anything, if you have any objectives, you've got to use reason, since that's the path to achieving your ends. So in sum, why be rational? Why follow the facts, track the truth, try to access reality, identify and integrate the material of the senses? Because it's practical. It's necessary to achieve your purposes. Why do purposes require reason? Because A is A. Okay, still with me? This is a little bit of the more difficult stuff that we're doing today. Tomorrow will be a little bit lighter. All right, the next item on the agenda, the rationality of ends. Question, and I should recognize here, some of the next section is actually overlaps with material I used in my course on morality last year. So for the few of you I recognize, I apologize. I didn't anticipate this. Had I would have told you in advance or in the description. Okay. So part of this next section is a little bit repetitious from a year ago. Question. What if a person's ends or purposes aren't themselves rational? It's one thing to recognize what our rational means to achieve some purpose. It's another to endorse that purpose as itself worthwhile, legitimate, right? If you aim to run a successful company, there are certain actions that might be rational, but maybe you shouldn't be running that company at all because it's really not what you want to do, and your true love in life and career rests in something else entirely, right? If your aim is to invade another country or to repress political opposition, maybe certain actions are rational, but certainly we can question the validity of such aims. So the question is, how can we justify the rationality of an end? Well, notice, a justification typically defends one action by its relation to something else. A court, for instance, might justify a ruling by some previous, well, it's redundant, by another judicial precedent. Or it might justify its ruling by the language of a particular statute or the Constitution, right? A coach in athletics might justify certain team policies by the latest findings of sports psychologists. Now, obviously, we can challenge those grounds themselves, right? We can question the wisdom of a judicial precedent of the Constitution on a particular issue, the propriety of a given psychological recommendation. How are those defended? By appeal to still further ends, meant to be served by their adoption, right? For instance, a particular precedent might be justified on the grounds that it will help to achieve parity among various groups. A particular coaching strategy might be justified by the aim of cultivating team spirit, okay? Yet again, of course, we can question the propriety of those ends. What justifies the justifying factors? If one thing is justified in terms of another, the propriety of those prior grounds can be challenged, and looming in the background is the obvious question, how far down can justification go? All reasoning must stop somewhere. The fact that ends are indispensable to rational action and that people choose their most basic ends does not mean that rationality is compatible with any ends that a person might embrace. Ends are not all mutually compatible. Crucially, ends are not all compatible with the requirements of living. While a person can choose not to adopt certain ends, he cannot escape the consequences. And this is the bedrock sanction of reason. Right? You can choose not to adopt certain ends, but you can't escape the consequences of your choices. Now, obviously, a person can forego certain ends without catastrophic results. Right? You can live without alcohol. You can live without a weekly massage. Impoverished, an existence as that might be. People will probably discover this year they can live without Seinfeld. Other ends carry more momentous ramifications, and the achievement of these ends is more critical to one's life. If you leave an eye infection untreated, you may go blind. If you take certain drugs, you may inflict lasting damage on your brain or nervous system. If you diet to extreme degrees, you may develop anorexia and lifelong health problems or die. The point is, at the deepest reaches in the chain of ends, reason still governs one's options. Or more exactly, reality governs one's options. A person's choices about what ends to pursue do not alter the nature of the world in which he acts. The ability to choose fundamental ends does not carry with it the ability to remake reality according to one's will. Thus, at whatever level of ends one is considering, again, modest or ambitious, short range, long range, it always makes sense to inquire into what you must do in order to achieve your ends. This makes sense insofar as you must realistically identify the means of achieving them. All right. Now, some would contend, that the fact that rationality of an action depends on a person's ends or aims means that we must resort to something external to reason to explain reason's authority. And allegedly, this stains the enterprise of rationality as arbitrary. You've got to reach outside of rationality to adopt these ends, but doesn't that render the whole thing just, non-rational? By injecting this allegedly non-rational element. That's the argument. That's the objection. But this is mistaken. If it's necessary to identify ends in order to have reasons for your actions, there can be no error in doing so, if it's truly necessary to have these ends, in order for us to even understand what rational or irrational action would be. If it's necessary, there can be no error then in adopting ends. What are your alternatives? The fact that the train of ends must eventually come to a stop does not preclude rationality. Rather, it's a person's adoption of ends, including a most basic or primary end, that is what gives rise to reason. It's necessary for reason to exert any claim on us. Without ends, again, one could have no reason to be rational. And this is reflected in Dr. Peikoff's writing that the question, why should I accept reason, is akin to the question, why should I accept reality? Now, all of this was summarized much more economically and much more elegantly by Ayn Rand, who said, and who explained, reason is man's means of survival. There you go. That's why you should be rational, okay? And, I take it most of you are familiar with her explanation of that, so I won't rehash it here. Okay, but in a nutshell, if you really, and that's great, that's the nutshell, that's the essence of the issue. Reason is man's means of survival. If you want to survive, get real, get rational, okay? All right, I know this is a bit much. I want to go on a little bit further before questions today, okay? So I know it's late in the day and all that, but try to stay with this. The going will get a little easier soon. Actually, I think the going gets easier right now. Now look, one might have a question. I have to acknowledge, as I said, one might have a question. Probably, I don't know, many of you would have this question, but, one that, I don't know, that other person you're going to talk to on the phone tonight who might not be an objectivist. Some people would have the question, well, look, are there any exemptions from this importance of proceeding by reason? Are there any areas in which it's okay to not go by the guidance of rationality? So let's think for a minute about this. Let's imagine not using reason in recreational activities and what you do on the weekends, your time off, okay? You've been working, you've been attending conferences that are stimulating to the rational mind, etc. But maybe, this might be a plausible candidate for an area of your life, what you do on your time off, but you don't need to be so worried about reason. So in the clubs you join, the sports games you play, gardening, dancing, bird watching, whatever it might be, consider now what it would mean to not use reason in this realm. It would mean not identifying and integrating relevant facts, the information that your senses feed you and inferences you make based on what you observe. Or maybe a better way of thinking about it would be this. If you did proceed by reason in making these decisions about how you're going to spend your free time, your weekends, and so on, if you did proceed by reason, what sorts of issues would you weigh, would you consider? Well, fairly obviously, you'd ask yourself things like, do I like this activity, right? Is this enjoyable? Is this fun? Is this relaxing? Is this, does this relax me from the tensions of the work week, or do I come back more aggravated than ever, just ready to wrap that goddamn golf club around somebody's neck, etc. Is this something I can do with my spouse or without my spouse? And have we been wanting to spend more time together since we work so much during the week we don't see each other? Or have we both been thinking, no, we'd really like to do a few more things on our own or with other friends, right? I mean, these are some of the considerations that you would consider if you were thinking about this rationally. We could list many others. Imagine now proceeding without reason. Setting all such questions, your answers to these questions, setting them all aside, choosing your weekend activities in complete disregard of all that. On what basis would you then choose your actions? And what would your choices deliver? I mean, if you chose just on the moment's whim what you felt like this Saturday morning or that Sunday afternoon, where would you get? You'd get nowhere. You'd make no progress learning, golf or tennis or the violin or about gardening or whatever it might be, right? You wouldn't really make progress cultivating your knowledge or your new skills. You'd get a lot of bills for sort of half-started projects that you then abandoned because you weren't in the mood. I mean, the whole thing sounds kind of idiotic, I think. I can't tell. It sounds pretty idiotic to me. It sounds like a kind of spiritual suicide as well. I mean, in effect, you'd be saying, by saying, I'm not going to ask any of those questions. Do I enjoy this? Is this relaxing? And that's one of the purposes I want from what I do on the weekends, etc. If you set all that aside, in effect, you'd be saying, I don't care what I do. I don't give a damn. I have no values. My other values, my money, my budget, my wife, whatever, they don't matter. I mean, that's the sense in which this sounds like it. Really, it's repulsive the more you think about it, I think. To disregard evidence, knowledge, to proceed as if you were blind, ignorant, right? To shun rationality in that way is to reduce your decisions to a crapshoot. It's to reduce your life to a crapshoot. Make it a game of chance. The point here is, again, even with recreation, an eligible candidate, if anything might be, for a realm where we might think reason is inappropriate, you need to use reason. And again, I would stress, remember, reason is not just the hard stuff, the sophisticated stuff. It's not only what Dave Harriman teaches in physics. It's not only, a Harry Binswanger lecture on higher level concepts, okay? It is that, but it's also the way we make choices. It's an option to be rational in making choices about the more everyday, such as what you're going to do tonight, okay? Now, obviously, reason's exact role does vary in different areas. Taste and feelings are a larger legitimate component in some decisions. For instance, taste and feelings might be more relevant in the realm of romance and vacation than in how to pass a college course. But even there, romance, vacation, you've got to tend certain facts. Can I afford this vacation? Sounds great. My friend who just took it, boy, it sounded terrific judging from his reports. Can I afford it? Why do I feel this way about that person? Are my feelings warranted? Are they consistent with my values? Okay, so even there, you can't ignore reason. To succeed in any area, to accomplish any objectives, you've got to heed the relevant facts. You've got to be rational. Okay. Let me pause now to take some questions, and depending on how many questions, we can either get started on the next item or not. But that was a lot for now. So, questions? Yes?
You all know by now that...
I'm sorry, I'm having trouble hearing you. Could you speak up a little more?
You all know by now that partial reasoning or partial rationality is the same as rational.
That partial reasoning is the same as irrationality.
Partial rationality is basically irrational, being irrational.
Okay.
Right, so but the most common notion is that, first of all, the logic is that you can't be consistently irrational because it will lead to death or destruction. Now, most people who are irrational, they do it moderately. I mean, they stop somewhere before they get injured. Mostly when I confront people like that, I say, why are you so stuck up, so rigid? It's more fun this way. Nothing is wrong.
Yeah.
Nothing that will nobody get hurt.
Right.
Just do it.
Okay. First, I guess, let me try to repeat the question. We all know, the claim was, we all know that to be partially rational is to be irrational. Yet frequently friends will say things like, when you criticize me for being partially rational, hey, look, I stopped short of killing myself. Nobody's harmed. What harm is done? Nobody got hurt. That sort of thing. Whew, somebody got hurt. Why be so rigid, you said, was part of this attitude, right? Guess why? I mean, just based on what I was talking about today, guess why it would make sense to be rigid? Pretty rigid, hey? Pretty rigid. I put this in certain places. I'm not going to get too close even in like with my eyeball here. Why? Because it's bloody rigid, right? Reality is rigid. We've all gotten sick. Everybody here has recovered to some extent. That's why you're here today, right? So we can withstand certain injuries. That is true, right? But that doesn't mean that the negatives, the injuries, don't take a toll. Whether it's a physical toll, a psychological toll, a combination of the two, right? I am still in detox from years of rationalism, from being raised as a Catholic and so on, and I can still find destructive elements of that. So it's not, oh, well, they didn't kill me, right? So they didn't kill me, thank God. There was room for recovery, right? But there were real injuries. In making irrational decisions, people can shoot themselves in the foot. Now, thank goodness we can also recover and take better courses. But that doesn't mean you didn't set yourself back by some of the injuries that you're imposing on yourself by the irrational decisions that you make. Granted, I think this is a very difficult point to convey to people of a certain mindset. So I don't mean to suggest, in one way it's a difficult point. In another way, I do think, going to reality and pointing out how rigid the facts of reality are can be helpful in making some indent with that line of reasoning. Okay. All right. Other questions for now? Yes?
When you have a strong emotion that you should or shouldn't do something, but you're logically thinking that, in other words, you're uncomfortable either in a situation because of physical things, i.e. height or whatever, or in dealing with people. In other words, should you follow your intuition sometimes, or should you just to yourself say that rationally I am not comfortable with this situation, let me back up and figure out why I'm not comfortable with it?
Well, okay, the question was essentially, should you follow your intuition sometimes, or should you back up and say, let me rationally evaluate why I'm feeling this way, this fear, this discomfort with a certain person? Right. Well, two things. First of all, literally we don't have intuitions. Now there are some usages of that term that can be okay. Some usages when it loosely means sort of, well, my initial sense of an issue. My very initial immediate reaction to this guy was funny. Sometimes we'll say my intuition. But we should be very careful about using that term, because a lot of people do mean it as literally some special form of knowledge that you have, and we've yet to see any evidence. There is no such form of knowledge, okay? But really, I think the thrust of your question is more in the second part of what you were saying. At least as I understand you. When we have these funny feelings, these misgivings, bad vibes, we've got to stop and, I think we should do exactly what you were saying we should do. That is, you've got to stop, pull back, and ask why. What's going on here? Why does that guy give me these funny feelings? What is it? And often, you can figure it out. Sometimes what you discover is it's just because he reminds me of Joe. He has the same voice as Joe, but that was Joe. This is Evan. This is a different person, right? Sometimes it's, well, no, there was that time he stood me up when we were supposed to get together for a drink, right? So emotions and feelings about people, those things are fast. One of the things I'll be saying tomorrow is, to be rational, sometimes we have to be slow. We have to really take our time and step back from those things to explore what's underneath the feeling. Is it valid or not, based on identifying the relevant facts and so on. Yeah. Yes?
One of your more subtle points had to do with the respect to the question that the dependence of rationality on ends requires jumping outside rationality.
Right.
And I was wondering if you would repeat or clarify why the dependency on ends doesn't require some form of irrational standard.
Okay. This is a question about one of the points I had made, which was that sometimes some people might object, but gee, if rationality depends on your having certain aims that you're seeking to attain, if that's necessary for us to even figure out what course of behavior is rational and which courses are irrational, doesn't that introduce something alien to rationality which renders the whole process arbitrary, right? And the question is, could I simply either repeat or try to clarify that? Well, I can try. Let's see. Why does that not render it irrational? I mean, it seems that one immediate thought is that what people pressing such an objection are looking for is some very odd form of rationality, a kind of rationality unto itself, untied to practical purposes in the real world. It seems like they're treating rationality as an end in itself. And rationality should be this thing that we all got to do, which is this beautiful, pure, and very important standard that we've all got to uphold. But once you, objectivists, bring in purposes, you're sullying it, right? You're dirtying it. Well, again, and I think I said something like this in the body of the talk today, rationality is not an end in itself. Rationality is for living. It's because reason is man's means of survival that Rand was so pro-reason, right? She wanted to live. That's what all of her writing is all about. So, I don't know if that's helpful, if that really... Okay. Yeah. I mean, ends are having purposes, and again, the primary purpose of living is what gives rise to the need to be rational. We're not going to live if we're not rational. That is why we must be. Okay. Yes, Jason? Sorry. I saw him first. Sorry. Jason?
Mine's quick, and I think you may have answered it, but I just want to hear what Mike said.
Sure.
Often I'll hear people say, well, reason's great, I use it, I know it's necessary, but...
Sounds like medicine.
Yeah, right. But when I get home after a long day's work, I just want to tune out and watch Seinfeld. I don't have to use my mind.
Okay.
In the time that I enjoy myself, and not necessarily that they mean serious activities, but just sort of read some trash novel or watch some TV show without much consideration.
Yeah. That's an interesting question. A couple of things. One is, by saying we must be rational, right? I don't mean this. I don't mean from the moment your eyes open in the morning to the moment they close at night when you go to sleep. Excuse me, you have to be reasoning in a very what we might think of as certain very purposeful ways, though even that way of putting it is misleading. Relaxing is purposeful. The mind needs rest sometimes. It's okay to watch certain TV shows, even and they don't all have to be on PBS, okay? You can watch a sitcom, right? I mean, there are occasions on which that's a reasonable thing to do. Even though in the course of watching it, it might not demand, it's not as demanding as the work you do all day, let's say, for instance, right? But it's not that you can tune out completely. I mean, even when, let's say, at the end of the day, you're tired, your mind has done all it can do on work, on other projects, I'm just going to listen to a little music before I go to bed. Fine. In bed or near bed, listening to music, relaxing, my mind is off for the day. In effect, you say to yourself, you start hearing crashes in the kitchen. You're home alone. What do? Do you say, well, I'm off for the day, Is there something going right? No. You say, ooh, reason, snap to. I've got to now pay attention again and mobilize my reason in a much more purposeful, focused way because there's a real potential danger here to me, right? So you've got to investigate. So, ultimately, I think we could even be more careful in answering, but that at least gives you the general outline. Okay. I think we're out of time. All right. So we'll continue tomorrow.